recorded. So you can see this evening's program later or share a link with your friends. A few quick things about Eyal before we get started. Eyal's most recent book, Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America, takes a very hard look, I think, at some of the ways inequality exists that we turn our back to, some of the ways that we don't talk about inequality in America. It's a very powerful book, beautifully written. Eyal has two other publications before this, two books, Absolute Convictions in 2006 and Beautiful Souls from 2012. He holds a BA in history from Brown University and a PhD from New York University. And Eyal is a recipient of the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism. He's received an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Cullman Center Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a little bit larger branch than the Stockbridge Public Library, but a public library no less, and a Puffin Foundation Fellowship at Type Media Center. Eyal, thank you so much for joining us. And I will turn the program over to you.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Wendy, and I want to thank Leslie and Stephen Schatz because they are close friends and members of your community and big supporters of the library, I know, and helped get this event to happen. And I'm delighted. I just wish that we were doing this in person, but this is the next best thing. And I should say I have a small Berkeley connection in that my mother-in-law's partner has a little cabin in Beckett, so not so far from Stockbridge, and we visit occasionally. And again, I wish we were doing this in person, but this is the next best thing. I'm going to begin. This is the first time I'm doing so bear with me, but I'm going to begin by reading a little bit from the book. And then I'll kind of lay out what the book is about, kind of helping set the context for what you're going to hear. But first, I'm just gonna jump in, and I'm not beginning at the very beginning. I'm starting in part 2 of the book, which is called Behind the Screens, and it is a chapter called Joystick Warriors. So, in the spring of 2006, Christopher Aaron started working 12-hour shifts in a windowless room at the Counterterrorism Airborne Analysis Center in Langley, Virginia. He sat before a wall of flat-screen monitors that beamed live classified video feeds from drones hovering over distant war zones. On some days, Chris discovered, little of interest appeared on the screens, either because a blanket of clouds obscured visibility, or because what was visible, goats grazing on an Afghan hillside, families preparing meals, was mundane, even serene. Other times, what unspooled before his eyes was jarringly intimate. Coffins being carried through the streets after drone strikes. A man squatting in a field to defecate after a meal. The excrement generated a heat signature that glowed on infrared. An imam speaking to a group of 15 young boys in the courtyard of his madrasa. If a Hellfire missile killed the target, it occurred to Chris as he stared at the screen. Everything the imam might have told his pupils about America's war with their faith would be confirmed. The infrared sensors and high-resolution cameras affixed to drones made it possible to pick up such details from an office in Virginia. But as Chris learned, identifying who was in the crosshairs of a potential drone strike wasn't always so easy. The feed on the monitors could be grainy and pixelated, making it easy to mistake a civilian trudging down a road with a walking stick for an insurgent carrying a weapon. The figures on screen often looked less like people than like faceless gray blobs. How certain could Chris be of who they were? Quote, on good days, when a host of environmental, human, and technological factors came together, we had a strong sense that who we were looking at was the person we were looking for, Chris said. On bad days, we were literally guessing. Initially, the good days outnumbered the bad ones for Chris. He wasn't bothered by the long shifts, the high-pressure decisions, or the strangeness of being able to stalk and potentially kill targets from thousands of miles away. Although Chris and his peers spent more time doing surveillance and reconnaissance than coordinating strikes, sometimes they would relay information to a commander about what they saw on screen, and, quote, 60 seconds later, depending on what we would report, you'd either see a missile fired or not, he said. Other times, they would trail targets for months. The first few times Chris saw a Predator drone unleash its lethal payload, the camera zooming in, the laser locking on, a plume of smoke rising above the scorched terrain where the missile struck. He found it surreal, he told me, but he also found it awe-inspiring, experiencing a surge of adrenaline and exchanging congratulatory high fives with the other analysts in the room. Chris's path to the drone program was unusual. He grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, in a home where red meat and violent video games were banned. His parents were former hippies who marched against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. But Chris revered his grandfather, a quiet, unflappable man who served in World War II. He also had a taste for exploration and for tests of physical fortitude, hiking and wandering through the woods in Maine, where his family vacationed every summer, wrestling, a sport whose demand for martial discipline captivated him. Chris attended the College of William and Mary in Virginia, where he majored in history. A gifted athlete, he cut a charismatic figure on campus, cultivating an air of independence and adventurousness. One summer, he traveled to Alaska alone to work as a deckhand on a fishing boat. During his junior year, in 2001, Chris woke up one morning to a phone call from his father, who told him that the Twin Towers and the Pentagon were on fire. Chris thought instantly of his grandfather, who'd served for 3 years as a military police officer on the European front after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He wanted to do something similarly heroic. A year later, after spotting a pamphlet at the William and Mary Career Service Office for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, a national security agency that specializes in geographic and imagery analysis, he applied for a job there. Chris began working as an imagery analyst at the NGA in 2005, studying satellite pictures of countries that had no link to the War on Terror. Not long after he arrived, an email circulated about a Department of Defense task force that was being created to determine how drones could help defeat al-Qaeda. Chris answered the call for volunteers and was soon working at the Counterterrorism Airborne Analysis Center. He found it exhilarating to participate directly in a war he saw as his generation's defining challenge. His pride deepened as it became clear that the task force was having a significant impact and that the use of drones was increasing. Chris spent a little over a year at the task force, including several months in Afghanistan, where he served as the point of contact between the drone center in Langley and special forces on the ground. After this, he worked for a private military contractor for a while. In 2010, an offer came from another contractor involved in the drone program to serve as an imagery and intelligence analyst. But as Chris mulled the terms, something strange happened. He began to fall apart physically. The distress began with headaches, night chills, joint pain, a litany of flu-like symptoms that every few weeks would recur. Soon, more debilitating symptoms emerged. Waves of nausea, eruptions of skin welts, chronic digestive problems. Chris had always prided himself on his physical fitness. Now, suddenly, he felt frail and weak, to the point that working for the contractor was out of the question. I could not sign the paperwork, he said. Every time he sat down to try, quote, my hands stopped working. I was feverish, sick, nauseous. Chris went back to Lexington to live with his parents and try to recuperate. He was 29 years old and in the throes of a breakdown. I was very, very unwell, he said. He consulted several doctors, none of whom could specify a diagnosis. In desperation, he experimented with fasting, yoga, Chinese herbal medicine. Eventually, his health improved, but his mood continued to spiral. Chris couldn't muster any motivation. He spent his days enveloped in a fog of gloom. At night, he dreamed that he could see, up close, in real time, innocent people being maimed and killed, their bodies dismembered, their faces contorted in agony. In one recurring dream, he was forced to sit in a chair and watch the violence unfurl. If he tried to avert his gaze, his head would be jerked back in place so that he had to continue looking. It was as though my brain was telling me, here are the details that you missed out on, he said. Now, watch them when you're dreaming. So that is the beginning of the section of dirty work about the drone wars. And question instantly arises, how does drone warfare qualify as dirty work? We tend to think of dirty work, at least in the colloquial sense, as something that is unpleasant and physically dirtying, like collecting the garbage on the streets. And drone warfare is the opposite of that. It's seen, at least, its reputation is that it is clean warfare, that it involves precision strikes. It has none of the messiness of conventional warfare. But the term dirty work in my book doesn't refer to physically dirtying tasks, though sometimes the tasks are physically dirtying. It refers to morally troubling activity that society depends on and tacitly condones, but doesn't want to hear too much about. So activity that is done in the shadows without too many questions asked. And I wasn't the first person to come up with this definition of dirty work. I draw it from a sociologist named Everett Hughes. And my book opens with the story of how Hughes came up with this concept. And as I say, Hughes was a big figure in sort of mid-century, mid-20th century American sociology, spent a semester teaching abroad a few years after World War II. And the place he taught was Frankfurt, Germany, just after the Nazi regime had fallen. Hughes had been to Germany before the war. And so he goes there and he reconnects with the people he knew. And the people he knew were not committed Nazis. They were what he thought of as good people, cosmopolitan intellectuals, liberals, fellow professors, wide-minded, tolerant people. And yet they had stayed in Germany during the Nazi regime. And Hughes, who was a natural provocateur, kind of wanted to talk to them about this. You know, what do you make of what just happened? What was done in this country? And he goes one night for tea to an architect's home. There are all these urbane people sitting around. And at one point, Hughes says, he brings up the atrocities of the Nazi era. And the architect instantly tells him what you would expect to hear, namely, I'm ashamed for my people whenever I think of it. Exactly what we would expect. But shortly thereafter, the architect sort of continues talking and says, Well, but the Jews, they really were a problem. They were taking all the good jobs in Germany. They were gathered in these filthy ghettos. Now, I'm not saying what the Nazis did was right, but something had to be done to settle this problem. I'm paraphrasing, but this is essentially what Hughes hears that night. And he records this conversation in his diary, in a journal he kept. And he notes in the diary that this is what he keeps hearing from the good people in post-war Germany. And out of this experience, he writes an essay called Good People and Dirty Work. And what he posits in the essay is that the good people and the dirty work are not separate, right? There's a relationship between these two groups. And it's not a relationship of explicit approval, right? It's not that the good people are cheering for the Nazis. Rather, it's a relationship of silent complicity, averting the eyes, not asking questions. And what Hughes argues and suggests in this essay, which to me was particularly fascinating, is that this is a dynamic that exists in every society, that there is dirty work that goes on. It doesn't have to be as horrific as in the Nazi case, but it goes on with what he called an unconscious mandate from society, from people who are well-intentioned, think of themselves as moral, but don't ultimately want to hear about what is being done in their name. And I'm just going to read the quote that really struck me in this essay. He writes at the end, "The question concerns what is done, who does it, and the nature of the mandate given by the rest of us to those who do it. Perhaps we give them an unconscious mandate to go beyond anything we ourselves would care to do, or even to acknowledge." I thought that was such a powerful thought, this idea of an unconscious mandate. And what really struck me about it is that it actually is more relevant to a society like the United States than to a place like Nazi Germany. Because in the case of Nazi Germany, or for that matter, contemporary North Korea, the dirty work that the regime undertakes is going to happen regardless of whether there's a mandate from the public or not, right? In some sense, it's a moot point. These are not regimes that seek the consent of the public. But in a democracy, the government does operate on at least some basis of consent, some basis of acceptance. And so it struck me that this concept is actually more relevant to a place like America than it is to a totalitarian society. And furthermore, Hughes himself said this. So after this essay appears, he gets some letters from other scholars contesting certain points he made about Nazi Germany. And he says, look, I didn't write this essay with Nazi Germany in mind. I wrote it for my fellow Americans. He made it very explicit, to warn us of dangers in our own midst, right? And I take this this essay and this point and apply it to contemporary America, where I think so much of the dirty work that goes on is done in the shadows. It's done out of sight, out of mind, much like the drone wars are. And crucially, it's organized in a way that doesn't affect the powerful and the elites of society. So the book actually begins with a quote from James Baldwin. In one of his books, he wrote, I'm just gonna find the quote. Baldwin wrote, "The powerless must do their own dirty work. The powerful have it done for them." Now, he wasn't referring to what I mean by dirty work, but that is essentially what I argue and try to show in the book. That if we think about the dirty work done in industrial slaughterhouses, if we think about the dirty work of running America's prison system, which is the largest prison system in the entire world, if we think about the dirty work of roustabouts who drill and frack fossil fuels in places like the Gulf of Mexico, or in places in this country where fracking is happening, if we think about the dirty work of the forever wars and who actually gets recruited to fight our wars. In all of those cases, it's not the sons and daughters of the powerful. It's people with fewer choices and opportunities. And so the book is both an examination of dirty work in these different realms and an effort to broaden the conversation about inequality, because we've generally had a conversation in which the focus is on income, on wealth, on material disadvantages and disparities. And that's hugely important. But economic inequality mirrors and reinforces something else, I argue, and that's moral inequality. Who ends up doing the dirty work in our society? It's undocumented immigrants. It's people in dying towns in the heartland, where it so happens many of the prisons and jails built during the era of mass incarceration are located, right? And more privileged members of society not only don't work in these fields, they don't even see what goes on. It's really hidden geographically, spatially, in some cases, as in the drone program, also legally. So it's swathed in secrecy, and yet there is, I think, a level at which all of this has what Hughes called an unconscious mandate, which again doesn't mean explicit support. It's more the, I can stop thinking about it and leave the problem to be settled for someone else to settle, to do in my name. And just to talk about this metaphor of solving problems. So let's think about the drone program and how drones became really the signature sort of form of warfare that continued our forever wars. That happened under Obama, right? It didn't happen under Bush. It happened in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq, when the country was exhausted by the war. The public had turned against it. Americans were sick of stories on the nightly news showing Americans dying. They were sick of paying for the war, of seeing the price tag going up. And yet there was this simultaneous idea that the bad guys are still out there. There still should be, some leeway for the military to continue carrying on these wars. And so what happened was drones. And drones didn't obviously replace on a one-to-one level those ground invasions, but they were the answer to the messiness of detaining and interrogating people at places like Guantanamo and in the black site prisons, right? Instead of doing that, what you saw was a sharp 10-fold increase under Obama of drone strikes that basically the target is eliminated. And to take it back to Chris and to take it back to the idea of moral inequality, what burdens Chris is the same thing that burdens all of the people I write about in the book. They are, one way to think of them is hidden injuries of class, moral and emotional burdens, stigma, shame, guilt, moral injury, a term that has arisen within the military, pushed to no small extent by veterans who have come back from the wars and who don't identify with the conversation around wartime trauma that is focused on PTSD. Because the conversation about PTSD is about brain injuries. It's about exposure to threats from the enemy, right? Roadside bombs that blew up, seeing a fellow comrade injured or have their life taken, surviving that and coming home and reliving that fear experience. It's a fear-based trauma. And it's sort of a medical trauma. It's a brain trigger that happens, at least as the way the military now talks about PTSD. Moral injury is something very different. It's an injury to the soul. And it isn't incurred because of what the enemy has done to us. it's incurred because of what we have done to the enemy, or rather to people we don't know are civilians or combatants, as was the case for so many people on the ground in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and was the case for Chris Aaron and for the other drone operators that I write about in the book. And when you think about it, the PTSD discourse makes no sense for drone operators, right? Because they are not on the ground, they are not there. So they don't have this fear-based trauma, this trigger of near-death experiences. What they do have is high exposure to really extreme graphic violence, bombs exploding in civilian areas, coffins in the streets, some of the things I just described that start recurring for Chris, and that it turns out are a major concern within the military, because the rate of burnout within the drone program is so high, right? They can't get enough people to do this work, I would say this dirty work, because it's morally and ethically challenging. And one of the reasons it's morally and ethically challenging, even for people who believe in the mission, and Chris, as people who will read the book will come to see, Chris comes to doubt the mission. He starts to intuit and realize precisely actually what we just saw unfold, which is that these strikes, this war, was not winning hearts and minds, particularly in the Afghan countryside. And on that trip to Afghanistan that he took, he actually saw that, because there were areas of the country where all these strikes had happened, and things were worse in those areas, not better, in terms from the US war perspective, right? These were areas soldiers could no longer go to. And so he starts to kind of doubt this mission. But even if one believes in the mission, you're fighting a war from a distance without any risk to yourself. Now, of course, as a society, this is exactly what we decided to do, right? Sparing our boys from the danger of incurring, casualties, getting shot at, and so forth. But what does it do to a combatant to be fighting a war in which there's no risk to them? There's life and death risks to the targets. And you can see the targets on these screens. Even if the rest of society is not watching, they are watching. And those decisions can impact innocent civilians, families, fellow soldiers on the ground, all of these things that lead to what I kept hearing when I visited drone bases from the psychologists and chaplains who are on these bases, which is a form of real moral anguish unfolding within the minds of these drone operators. And it's very contrary to, I think, the public image, at least in the beginning, of the drone program, which I think sort of stereotyped drone warfare as, in essence, playing video games, right? Just pushing buttons, not thinking about it, munching on, as one of the drone operators said to me, sort of derisively, thinking of what the public thought. They just think we press the buttons, we munch on our Doritos, we press another button, we go home, we don't think about this. And she went on to say, none of them know that we don't go home. We go to bars and get shit-faced so that we can forget about everything we've just seen all day. And so there's a real moral eeriness to this whole project. And yet the project I do think, had an unconscious mandate from a country that on the one hand didn't want to hear about the wars and was tired of the wars, and on the other hand, didn't want to ask too many questions because there was still this kind of lingering fear. Oh, Al-Qaeda's out there, those groups are out there. Maybe we shouldn't ask questions. Maybe we should just let the military take care of, what Cheney referred to as the dark side. The military example, I don't want to go on for too long about, because the military, as I say in the book, the percentage of Americans who have served in the military since 2001, since the attacks of on the World Trade Center, it's 1%. So 99% of the public has not served, has not been directly involved. And the reason I don't, in that sense, it's not representative of the book, because the other cases in the book, I think, reach much more deeply into the heart of the country and into our lifestyle, our, what we as good people in the United States do on a daily basis, where behind the scenes there is dirty work involved. The slaughterhouse section of the book is sort of a striking example of that, because I look at poultry slaughterhouses in particular. And poultry is America's most popular meat. And of course, during the pandemic, slaughterhouses, not just poultry, but all the entire meatpacking industry, was very much, quite suddenly, in the news, because we suddenly had this realization, oh, society actually can't function if these places don't keep producing what they're producing, right? Someone has to, the fresh direct packages will not come with chicken and beef and pork and all these other things if those factories do not keep running. And so, of course, they did keep running, in part because Trump ordered them to keep running, notably without requiring any of the companies, involved to institute distancing and safety measures for the workers involved. But that relationship between, in a sense, the privileged members of society who could shelter in place and the essential workers who were ordered, in this case, to go to work and continue to produce this, to do what they were doing. I think it came home in the pandemic and was revealed in a kind of new way. And in dirty work, there's a very similar dynamic going on, right? I suggest and try to show that we rely on these morally troubling activities to run our society, to take care of problems that we don't want to think too much about. And we might not explicitly approve of what's going on if we saw it, but that nevertheless get taken care of by this kind of shadow class of workers. And the book opens, I'll open it up to questions because I want to have a conversation, but the book opens in the prison system, and it opens with what I think is sort of a very dramatic example of this notion that Hughes proposed, this sort of idea of dirty work solving problems. It's the mental health ward of a prison, where the mental health aides who work there see the patients entrusted to their care being mistreated and abused in very graphic ways. And that's not terribly surprising, because people in the throes of mental health crises should not be placed, and the last place one would think they should be is in a correctional institution, in a security environment, where they can be, yelled at, demeaned, provoked, abused, beaten. And these things happen routinely. And as I go on to say in that chapter, unfortunately, jails and prisons do the dirty work of warehousing the mentally ill, and particularly poor people who are mentally ill, in a society that doesn't adequately fund a public mental health system. And so as a consequence, the mental health aides in these prisons are thrust into these incredibly wrenching moral situations and end up encumbered by some of those hidden injuries of class that I've described. So maybe I should stop there. I've gone past 30 minutes and welcome questions from folks. I haven't spoken at all about why I decided to write this book in the first place, or the methods that went into it. I'd be happy to open it up.
Thank you, Eyal, so much. If you don't mind, I'll start the questions, because I'm so interested in your process and your relationships with these people that you really do get to know. I'm sure in the writing process, it's certainly in the reading process, we get to know these people. Kind of a twofold question. Did you encounter a lot of people who didn't want to talk to you before you found the right person? And what kinds of surprises did you encounter? I think you have a very solid theory of how we operate as a nation around dirty work. Did anything surprise you in these conversations with people?
Yeah, so finding people to talk to was the hardest thing about writing this book. And it's not terribly surprising, I suppose, given what I've just described they go through. And I love that phrase, the hidden injuries of class, because one of the reasons these injuries are hidden is that there's shame involved, and there's stigma involved, and there's a sense of degradation involved. And I think of that often when I think of the slaughterhouse workers. In this case, this poultry slaughterhouse was mostly Mexican immigrants, many of them undocumented. And we know the story of the physical toll that working in a slaughterhouse in contemporary America takes, or at least many of us know it. It is physically injurious because the line speeds go so quickly in these plants that repetitive strain injuries develop. In some slaughterhouses in America, the turnover per year is 100%, right? People injure their wrists, they injure their shoulders, they're doing these motions over and over again as the meat is going around this conveyor belt. And then they start to fall apart. And lo and behold, because they're undocumented or they're very vulnerable, part of a vulnerable population, they don't have much. They don't have the sense of security and the power to complain or to say something. So many of them are just fired because they can't do the job anymore. But the physical injury is not what really stays with me. What really stays with me is the degradation and the ways in which, in this particular plant, the women in the plant were not allowed to take bathroom breaks because it slowed the lines. And they had one break, a lunch break, but it was too busy then. Not everyone could go. And so they're ordered by their supervisors and yelled at and reprimanded if they ask to leave to go to the bathroom. So what do? They start showing up at work with an extra pair of pants or with sanitary napkins to go to the bathroom and keep working. This is in contemporary America, to feed Chick-fil-A and the entire industry we have around this. And every single worker I interviewed from that plant cried when they told me about their experience in the plant. And that was what really stays with me. It wasn't, yes, they would also say, my shoulders hurt, my elbow is messed up, I can't lift things anymore. But it was the sense of just being, dehumanized in a sense, that really was wrenching. And throughout the book, it's those wounds that I think I was most interested in writing about and chronicling, and that of course are very difficult to write about because it's private and it's very painful to expose. And yet, I guess, and this gets a little bit to the surprise aspect, the other dynamic that would happen is once I got the trust of, say, one worker at this particular plant or in the prison where I wrote about, then others did want to talk to me. They would sort of pass word among each other. And it was almost like I was a kind of therapist that they don't have, or a kind of an outlet, a person to turn to talk about these hidden injuries that they've sustained and that have encumbered them for years, but that to go unnoticed otherwise, right? So in some sense, it became these very intimate relationships with the people I was writing about who seemed to want to tell me what they'd been through. Because, and in some cases, I have to say, they hadn't told their own family members what they'd been through because of this sense of just feeling dirtied by the whole thing. The one last thing I'll say is that sometimes it was hard to find people because the workers are scared, and they're scared that they'll be fired, or they're scared that in the case of the immigrants, they'll be deported. And I actually did a lot of research and visited another slaughterhouse that's not in the book. I went to this place, I thought I had everything set up, but then the Trump administration raided a plant in Tennessee. And you can read about it, I think it was 2017, 2018. And they arrested and deported more than 100 workers from this small town in Tennessee. And that spread throughout the industry. It sort of sent this chilling effect. And none of the workers at that slaughterhouse would talk to me, even anonymously. They would not, just didn't want to go anywhere near a reporter. They didn't trust me. They were frightened. So that was another challenge that went into this.
Yeah. Right.
Hi, Claudia, you have a question?
Hi, I was obviously didn't do the video before. I don't have a question. Where is it? I have 30 pages left. It's right here.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm very taken by it. I just have to say, I almost wrote a letter to the editor of this week's New Yorker. There's an article called Storm Chasers, which is, I think, very much the same issue, the same population. And I just was, I think it was, I don't think it was your book. I think it was there. People say, so why do you stay with this horrible work? It's so damaging to you physically and mentally. And in this article, they say it's like domestic violence. People are afraid to leave their abusive spouse because that's their only source of income. And I think a lot of the people that you spoke to in your book, too bad that they can't leave their jobs because of the physical, mental, emotional abuse, and how demeaning it is and how horrible everybody's boss or supervisor is. But if they leave, either if they do the right thing, either they'll be deported or ICE will be called, or they'll lose their job. It speaks to so much that's going on today. So I guess I wanted to say thank you. And I probably will finish the book tonight. And I was very happy that I could hear you speak because I'm totally immersed. And so thank you.
Thank you very much. And I should say that one of the things people often ask me, well, where's the hope here? What is the, is this just the kind of thing that's going to go on forever regardless, and what can be done about it? And to me, what's really interesting is how the pandemic and post, if we can start to begin to talk about a post-pandemic world, has really brought the question of the division of labor and labor that people don't want to do to the fore. I mean, we're seeing right now a lot of people, in this labor shortage, who don't want to do shitty jobs and are deciding, you know what? I only live once. I was miserable when I was doing that. The pandemic, threw me into some financial turmoil, but I don't want to go back to the fast food chain or trucking, or there was an article today in the Times about truckers and the shortage of truckers and how that's affecting the supply chain. I think it's, in that sense, a really fascinating moment in the country in terms of raising questions about labor and about how we organize it, how demeaning and degrading it is in so many cases. I mean, certainly in the case of the examples I give and of what I call dirty work, but even more broadly in terms of, just all kinds of service jobs and cleaning hotels. Now there's a counter reality, which is the one you referred to. How do you leave when you need to make ends meet? And frankly, I'm fascinated by how that's going to play out, and to see where this goes, because there's only so long if we don't have a robust welfare state in this society, and we don't, then what do people do when the money runs out, right? What do people do when they're desperate? And in the case of the prison workers I wrote about, in the case of the slaughterhouse workers I wrote about, they were operating under what I refer to as the pressure of economic necessity, a phrase that is in the book. It's not, I didn't coin it. It was coined by the philosopher Michael Sandel of Harvard. But that's what bears down on them, right? They have these thoughts of, well, maybe I should leave, but they also need to pay the bills. They need to feed their families. They need to make ends meet. So this dynamic, I think, is kind of going to be very interesting to watch in the months and years ahead. And in terms of the hope aspect, my hope is that a conversation is opening up about all of these things. We operated for a very long time thinking this was natural, this was normal. And then the pandemic happens and you suddenly realize, oh, wait, there's a whole hidden class of workers who do these essential jobs and get paid a pittance, and are now exposing themselves to injury and potentially death. And that was okay with everyone before. Maybe we should strive for something different. Are there other questions?
Steve, you have a question, and then after Steve, there is a question in the chat box.
Great.
Good. Can you hear me now?
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Eyal. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
Excuse me. Eyal, I think what is as concerning to me is that the implicit consent to the use of dirty labor, if you will, dirty with quotes around it, has become something that is explicit. It's no longer hidden in this age, and it's not just the last 5 years. We tend to focus on the Trump years as being the worst, but this has been going on for a long time. The use of torture it predates Trump, as you well know. The attempt to fight clean wars, so-called clean wars, is something that came about as a result of the horrific deaths on the battlefields of Western Europe during World War I, and the inability of the Allies to raise armies after that because no one would fight.
Right.
And so the so-called strategic bombing in World War II was an attempt to divorce the actual act of the killing from the deaths themselves. This is nothing new. This has been going on for a long time, which is not to say that it's any more tolerable than it was then. That's just my observation.
Well, it's a great point, Steve, and I think that so I had the luck to have some really, really smart reviewers of my book who were both really smart and generous. And there was a particular review by Tamsin Shaw in the Times, and she raised this very point, very gently, but very smartly, basically reflecting on the fact that it's implicit in my book that there is a kind of moral revulsion to these things, right? That you have to hide it or push it to the margins and push it out of the way because it elicits disgust and disapproval. But maybe it doesn't. And maybe there are large parts of America that are actually perfectly fine with it, and not to single out Trump, but Trump, his genius, his sort of evil genius, if you want to put it that way, is a real sense of what gets people excited and what this sort of, I can say this because I know you're thinking it. And notice how he talked about war, right? On the one hand, he said, I was against the Iraq war, those big boondoggle war. Of course he wasn't, but I was against those things. But when I'm in office, by the way, we're going to take the gloves off, basically, he told those same audiences. And we're not just going to bomb, we're not just going to kill the terrorists, we're going to go after their families too, right? And this would get, from the same audiences that cheered the anti-war message, there would be a cheer for that. And that's that moment where you wonder, I think in a very reasonable way, to what extent can we say that indiscriminate strikes on innocent civilians, or this prerogative that we will go after the bad guys, and if we hit the families, we hit the families. To what extent has that become acceptable? And I think there's a legitimate question about that. I don't think it's clear. When I think about the torture question, I always think of Abu Ghraib, and I think about the prison I write about in the first section of this book, where the abuses, and I don't mean to get too graphic, but the abuses rose to the level of what was happening in Abu Ghraib. They were torturing people, torturing incarcerated people in this facility. Torture has not gone away, and in fact, I think it's fairly endemic in America's prison system. Look at the number of people who are held in solitary confinement, right? Which many people regard as a form of torture. In the United States, it's called nice things like administrative segregation and so forth, but it has, I think, psychological effects that rise to the level of torture. And we didn't really come to terms with Abu Ghraib. What we did is we blamed it on a few bad apples. And that's one of the themes of dirty work. I say over and over again in the book that on the rare occasions when we do confront what goes on in these kind of hidden worlds, it tends to be the few bad apples that get blamed. It's not the people in charge. It's certainly not the governor who runs the Department of Corrections that oversees all of this and tolerates it. It's a couple of lowly guards, right, at the Dade Correctional Institution who were shifted out of their jobs, it's blaming what one corrections officer called, the lowest ranking man. That's who you look for. You pin the blame on that person, and then the system goes on, and the people above them aren't only not held accountable, they're promoted very often. So I think there is in the Abu Ghraib story a kind of metaphor for how dirty work functions as well. We don't really, no officials were held accountable for Abu Ghraib, no senior officials. And in a very similar way with dirty work, when we do hold people accountable, it tends to be the people with the least power in those institutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the week in which we appear to have come close to passing an infrastructure bill, I'm reminded of the fact that the infrastructure of this country, bridges, tunnels, and railroads, were built by people who were brought here specifically for the purpose of providing their labor at great cost to them, and hidden from public view. This is nothing new. This has been the exploitation of the weak is a universal theme, unfortunately.
It certainly is. I guess I would say one thing to kind of one of the things that fascinated me about dirty work in contemporary America is that I think dirty work is very old, right? And it's been going on. There are examples in the book. I talk about slave traders. I talk about money lenders. I talk about all kinds of forms of ethically, in some cases, ethically appalling labor. In some cases, just stigmatized, culturally stigmatized labor.
Al, remember who built the pyramids?
Yes, right. There we go. Thank you. Even further back. But what's interesting to me, and the other sort of theory in the book that I draw upon is this notion of civilization that's presented by Norbert Elias. And he wrote this 2-volume book called The Civilizing Process. It's a fascinating book, and it's actually about table manners. It's about, blowing your nose. It's about carving meat at the table, the dead animal. And what Elias points out is that things that what he calls the civilizational curve is about hiding these disturbing events behind the scenes of social life, right? We don't do these things at the table. You do not sneeze, you do not pick your nose, you do not go to the bathroom, you do not bring the dead animal to the table. You have it done at the butcher's shop or in the kitchen, behind the scenes, and then you bring it out if you're civilized. And it's a book that has gained currency and that I draw on very directly, because you can apply it to so many things, like the contemporary penal system in the United States, right? We don't flog people in this country. That would be barbaric, right? But we, as I just said, administer administrative segregation to thousands of people. We lock them in isolated cells where they have no light for days, sometimes weeks. And so there's a whole school within criminology now that has taken this idea, this notion of civilized punishment, which is the chapter title to it's the title to one of my chapters. And basically, the argument I make is that in a civilized society, dirty work is pushed behind the scenes of social life, right? We don't want to see it. We don't want it presented. We want it swathed in all kinds of, cloaked and hidden from us. So I think that dirty work is an old thing, but I do think the form changes, and not always in good ways.
And society as a whole does not hold itself to as high a moral standard, I think, today as it might have decades ago. At least people had the pretense of having a sense of morality. Now there's seems to be no shame in revealing everything about yourself, good or bad, and pillorying other people without a thought to what you might be doing.
I won't comment on our moral decline, but I also won't disagree. Thank you. I will say on a somewhat more positive note that the book is organized around, as I said, prisons, which the backdrop to that is mass incarceration, fossil fuels, the industrial meat system. And in many of these areas, public consciousness has actually dramatically increased. There's been a turn away from thinking, oh, our industrial food system is just fine. I think very few people think it's just fine. And that comes out in people, going to supermarkets and looking for, some kind of poultry or beef that is morally acceptable, that doesn't seem to have the taint of a system they kind of sense is, ecologically unsustainable, exploitative to animals, and exploitative to workers. So similarly with mass incarceration, of course, there's been a pretty dramatic shift in public opinion. So that's a slightly more hopeful sign of things. Wendy, are there other questions?
There's, we are running out of time. There is
yes.
a question in the chat box, though, from Matthew. And Matthew's wondering if there are parts to the book about employees who suffer because they're required to lie to customers.
That's a great question. No, I did not look at that, but that's such an interesting thing. Thank you for the question. I'm tucking it away as something perhaps I should write about. I did not explore it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eyal.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And appreciate the questions and appreciate this opportunity.
This has been a wonderful evening, and thank you for your thoughtful reading and presenting for us. We could talk about it for hours, I'm sure, but sadly we have to sign off, and I look forward to reading more from you. Thank you so much, and have a good evening, everyone.
You too. Take care.